Welcome back to In-Depth Literature, everybody's favorite bookish place on the internet. I didn't really mean to leave y'all hanging. I know it's been a while since we last uploaded. I just started classes again. I actually took ill with a cold and just been spending some time with the family and just getting some stuff done around the house. I hope everybody had a great holiday season. We are in to 2025 already. We have a lot of material to cover here rather. Hopefully you're not recovering too hard from 2024, but we're still doing lots of reading over here, and I hope you all are as well. And I hope this video inspires everybody to keep reading and to read what you're passionate about. Make sure you guys follow me on Instagram at Andrew Marlowe Artist Official. Send me an email at andrewmarlowe22@gmail.com. You might notice I'm still a tad bit stuffy. Been suffering from a really bad head cold. But we're back in the routine of reading. We're back in the routine of uploading, hopefully. But like I said, with making literature content, I don't want to just bang out reviews and book hauls just for the heck of it. I want to enjoy the process and talk about books and review books and do book hauls that are meaningful to me. Like I said, we have a lot of material to cover. Is there anything else I wanted to mention in the intro? I don't think so. Let me know if you recognize any of the books in the background. We've been kind of rearranging some things. In this video, we're just going to kind of hold ourselves accountable and sort of start to analyze some of the books. These are not going to be a full analysis. We're going to go back and do individual in-depth, full-length analyses of all this material, most likely. This is just kind of a sort of a reading update vlog / analysis to hold ourselves accountable, to stay consistent, and to sort of try to perceive in sort of a short-winded manner all the complex themes, a little bit of the plot of each of these books that we're reading. We've got quite a stack here, a really great variety of books that we've been reading. Just to sort of refresh everybody's memory, I think I've shown them on Instagram, but we are reading Portrait of a Killer by Patricia Cornwell, a little bit different than obviously the literature content, but you guys know I'm a huge true crime sort of historical buff. So this is going to be interesting. I'm not going to talk too much about this today, but we'll go back to it. Also, we've been really getting into Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility, which has been a really good exploration of sort of that whole female-driven 18th century literature, I guess you could say. Really great stuff there. I'm going to try to keep this stack as organized as possible. Really enjoying Herman Melville's Moby Dick as well. I'm going to try not to hold the books in front of my face because it messes up the lighting. I'm going to talk a lot about Herman Melville in this video. Obviously, David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest. We're blowing through this pretty well, I would say. It's pretty mammoth. It's pretty obese. And I think Throne of Pages would really be proud of that flop. Some people have a thing for floppy books, and this book is super floppy. Anyway, and then we're reading Liz Phair's memoir called Horror Stories. So let's start from let's start with the best, or should we start from the top, or should we start from the best? I don't know. Let's start with Herman Melville's Moby Dick. This is probably one of my favorite classics that I've ever read. I did not expect to enjoy Herman Melville's Moby Dick quite as much as I am. I thought that I would enjoy it, but I just wasn't sure what that nautical, obsessive, sort of cetology, driven narrative that cetology is the study of whales, by the way, that Herman Melville was presenting from us. I've heard some things that it was boring. I heard it was too grandiose. It was too long-winded, but it's turning out to be one of my favorite classics, and it's extremely readable. It's not difficult to read. It's engaging. The chapters are short. The language is slightly flowery, but not really. It's more of just really intellectually explained in a really nice way. We're making tons of annotations, and we are going to cover annotations in this book. For example, for this particular edition of Moby Dick, the cover is blue. Obviously, the themes are nautical. He's talking about whales and fish and being out on the open sea. So you just get a lot of blue feelings, a lot of blue thoughts, a lot of blue images in your mind, maybe dark greens, maybe some earth colors perhaps. So with that in mind, we'll talk a little bit about annotations here pertaining to that. We're sticking with blue primarily with this narrative, a little bit of pinks and a little bit of earth color with the greens. And I also try to stick with that with the, primarily this book has been mostly all blue highlighters. And the reason I like to use highlighters is because it's a lot cleaner than just underlying with a pen or a pencil. You're going to be drawing all over the words, drawing all over the margins. I still really enjoy writing with a pen or a pencil in the margins, but as far as underlying, I would go with highlighters. It's much cleaner. You can go back and see what you've, wanted to annotate a lot better. Every once in a while, I will use a pen because I just think it looks cool. I really like the aesthetic of having some pen marks in your novels and your books. But let's talk a little bit about the themes of Moby Dick. Obviously, it is sort of this Gnostic quest of not only Ishmael sort of observing the Gnostic quest of obviously Ahab, the very revenge whale Moby Dick obsessed captain who lost his leg at the hands of Moby Dick, or so it's portrayed. And but there's also sort of this juxtaposition, this struggle of the sort of the Christian traditional worldview versus the more less structured, esoteric, one of our favorite words here on this channel, viewpoint of the pagan world. Obviously, we have the brilliant native character named Queequeg, who Ishmael has a rather interesting, slightly even romantic, I would suggest, affinity for. Was Herman Melville possibly on the spectrum of being gay, maybe bisexual? I think that's worth exploring. Maybe I'm totally overreaching there or reading too far into it. But I just love the way that Herman Melville, and particularly Ishmael, sort of has a bird's eye perspective. And we don't really get a lot of Ishmael per se. We don't get a lot of Ishmael's opinions or worldviews. It's more of like this sort of omnipresent esoteric narrator that really is sort of structuring this narrative for us. So the sort of the Gnostic quest of Moby Dick, of Ishmael / Ahab, and sort of the way that the irrational, revenge motivated sort of is observed by the more sympathetic intro and retrospective worldview of Ishmael. It's just a really brilliant, beautiful description of not only the history of cetology, the study of whales, but also this Gnostic religious quest. What are these characters after? How do they relate to each other? And we get just these beautiful juxtapositions of the pagan worldview that's explored through sort of the reflections of Ishmael on his friend Queequeg, the native. And he has, Queequeg has sort of this idol wooden statue that he carries around that sort of represents heathenism. Moby Dick is not only a sort of a study, a psychological study of revenge and religion and history, but it's also this emotional, existential response to nature itself. And that's kind of where we would dig further into sort of the Gnostic quest, perhaps like, Blood Meridian obviously was very inspired by something like Moby Dick, and you can kind of see that seafaring quest or the quest out into the desert like we would see with Blood Meridian, or sort of the religious quest of maybe the Holy Grail, or anything that comes up with sort of that desire to seek the secrets of the earth, the secrets hidden within the earth and of the sea. We get that beautiful sort of exploration, that celebration of that through Herman Melville's Moby Dick. Obviously, we're going to do a full depth analysis of that. Hopefully, that's a good little introduction. There's a lot of different ways you can interpret Moby Dick. Yeah, a lot of different ways you can interpret Herman Melville's worldview. But I would say it's definitely very, very dense. We could say it's a good word to use. A very dense exploration of sort of a lot of the existential, religious, psychological, spiritual themes of not only nature and religion, but also of the self and of the soul, and of a man's quest on earth, and sort of good and evil and revenge and all these beautiful things. We are keeping some really great epic tabs. And just for the record, we are on page 554. Moby Dick clocks in at roughly 655 pages, depending on which edition you own. So we've got about another 100, maybe a little less, pages of Moby Dick to go. Really, really enjoying that. Hope you guys are excited to read Moby Dick. I hope you guys will be inspired to adopt some of these books. Let's go next to Sense and Sensibility. A little bit of a slow burn. Took a little time for me to get interested in these characters. I wasn't quite sure where it was going. It seemed a little bit pretentiously boring and just sort of not really exciting at first, but I really am getting into the worldview, and I'm really becoming interested, and I'm starting to care about Eleanor and Marianne and the complexities of their relationship with Mrs. Dashwood, and obviously John Willoughby, who I don't particularly like in this particular section of the book. He's a bit of a tool. Also, we have Colonel Brandon, which is a complex character as well. And I would say this 1700s female-driven upper-class literature can be a little bit stuffy, can be a little bit hard to approach. But once you kind of get past the flowery, convoluted language, you will start to become invested and really fall in love with these wonderful characters. So this is actually my first experience with Jane Austen, and I think I was just kind of putting her off in the back of my mind. We do have some brilliant annotations here as well. And obviously this is sort of a feminine, a blue cover with sort of a feminine theme. So we're sticking with pink and blue annotations only in this as far as these little tabs go. But let's get back a little bit more to the narrative. But just a lot of complex, very subtle sort of character interactions, a lot of backdoor dealings emotionally and mentally, a lot of gossiping, a lot of pressures of social class and financial stability, and sort of the way that these women interact with each other, and the way that they seek love as a way to validate their insecurities, or to also to obviously to fall in love, but also to validate the less confident parts of their souls and of their psyches, and also the way that they interact on sort of a psychosexual level with the male characters, and as well as vice versa, and sort of the way that impressions, the first impressions or the impressions of status and reputation play such a strong role in the universe of Jane Austen. So I've really been enjoying that exploration. And obviously with the annotations here, we'll talk a little bit about that, sticking with highlighters, blue and pink, because of sort of the feminine romantic theme. And I think that's a great way to really make books your own, is to curate not only the books and the topics and the authors that you love, but also artistically mark your books up and annotate your books in a manner that reflects not only the importance and the impact that the narrative and the writing is having on you, but also sort of juxtaposing it with the theme. Obviously we're sticking with blue and pink for this sort of overly flowery feminine narrative. And I will say the writing in Jane Austen, is quite beautiful, but like I said, it can be hard to digest at first. It can be hard to approach, but I'm so grateful, I'm so thankful that I've starting to just now dig into the world of Jane Austen. We did read some other feminine literature, Frances Burney's Evelina, and we've read some, Ethan Frome, and we've read some quite a few, not as many as I'd like to, but we have read some female authors over the past years over here on In-Depth Literature. But I'm so glad to be getting into, such a profound classic known as Sense and Sensibility, and I'm really looking forward to the rest of Jane Eyre's oeuvre. And I encourage you guys to explore Jane Eyre. Don't be too intimidated. It might not be your cup of tea. We do plan to go back and read some Charlotte Bronte as well, Jane Eyre. And this is just I think this is a beautiful entry novel into Jane Eyre, I would say. Although it's a little bit flowery, it can be hard to approach. Compared to some of her others, this is fairly maybe more exciting, more accessible than, something like, I don't know, one of her more dry, complex sort of novels. But anyway, really enjoying Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility, and I will let you guys know what our final thoughts on these wonderful characters are when we come to its completion. Up next, we have the brilliantly complex and convoluted dystopian addiction, media obsessed world of David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest. Really, really surprised how much I'm actually enjoying Infinite Jest, and how approachable Infinite Jest and David Foster Wallace actually become once you actually put in the work and really start to get to know these characters, really familiarize yourself with the worldview. We are on page 460. We're not blowing through it or rushing through it, but I would say that we're reading it fairly consistently. I'm reading it 3 to 4 to 5 times a week, doing a lot of good reading sprints with Infinite Jest. And what I love about Infinite Jest is that I don't feel compelled to stick to any rules with the annotations. We've got sticky notes, we've got tabs of all shapes and sizes, all colors. But I will say, as far as the annotations go, we've transitioned from the traditional sticky notes that you stick on top of the pages to these tabs. This is sort of more like a feminine, girly literature thing, I guess, that I sort of picked up on for watching Throne of Pages and stuff like that. And it actually doesn't damage your books quite as much. Maybe it does. I don't know. It looks a little better. It looks cool to sort of have the juxtaposition of your tabs coming out of the side of the book. and also juxtaposed with the ones coming out on the top. I don't know, just a little bit of inspiration for you guys. Hopefully you guys can use my annotation system or take little bits and pieces from my annotation system and sort of use that to create your own. But the fascinating dystopian worldview of David Foster Wallace and the way that media or I should say, excuse me, addiction to media and entertainment, the way that it sort of festers inside of people and festers and sort of decays society into this, very dystopian, pleasure-obsessed culture where we are left unfulfilled and unaccomplished, and we feel rejected. And most of these characters are struggling in some shape or form with either addiction or obsession with something, with some form of self-pleasure, with some form of obsession in general, whether that's intellectual obsession or obsession with a substance, obsession with accomplishment. There is a underlying narrative, a wonderful narrative of competitive sportsmanship that comes up in the world of David Foster Wallace. If you're not familiar with sort of his obsession with tennis, and it's sort of like Benjamin McVoy was talking about, how reading Infinite Jest in itself is sort of like a tennis match when you're going back between the narrative, and then you switch back between the endnotes. You're constantly flipping the book back and forth, sort of in this interactive, sort of very sportsman-esque reading experience that is not only complex, but it's also extremely engaging and really gets you thinking. It's a very convoluted dystopian sort of plot. We have the president, I think his name is Johnny Gentle or something like that, very eccentric and corrupt President Johnny Gentle, and we have the, I guess you could say, cross-dressing character of Steepley and his relationship with his other partner, and they're sort of working in sort of these covert socio-political ways to sort of infiltrate the political system. In addition to that, we talked about the ideas of addiction and the ideas of being a pleasure-obsessed culture, a pleasure-obsessed people, and we get these wonderful characters of Hal and Mario and James and Cadenza. There is an unfortunate theme of suicide and depression running throughout the worldview of Infinite Jest. We lost, James and Cadenza, obviously the father figure of Infinite Jest, I believe, to suicide, and we get a lot of retrospections back to what how the characters and the Incadenza family were affected by that suicide, were affected by addiction, and obviously Mario Incadenza is obsessed with sort of documenting and filming all of the happenings and the strange goings on at the Enfield Tennis Academy. But we also get some wonderful, retrospectives of addiction from the guy that runs the halfway house, Don Gately, as well as Harold Incadenza is a huge pothead, and he smokes tobacco, and you can see how his addictions are interfering with his ability to play tennis successfully throughout the narrative of Infinite Jest. A fascinating exploration of the fact that people are so well aware of addictions, shortcomings, of how the addiction is slowly eating away at them and harming them, yet they are so compulsively addicted to it, such as some of these characters are addicted to media and self-pleasure. And David Foster Wallace sort of invented this dystopian worldview where everybody is hooked on these what he calls entertainment cartridges. Nowadays that would be the equivalent of TikTok or YouTube or something, but it's obviously Infinite Jest is a product of its time, sort of socially and technologically speaking. David Foster Wallace was responding to the growth of technology that was taking place in the mid to late 90s. So it's a little bit a product of its time, but it's also highly relatable to the worldview that we're living in now. So I will encourage everybody to pick up Infinite Jest if you're bold, if you have a lot of time on your hands, and if you're obviously ambitious. It's going to take a lot of ambition and a lot of patience to get through the complex and convoluted worldview of David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest. So let's move on to the other books that we're reading here. So let's get into A Portrait of a Killer by Patricia Cornwell. This is something just to blow off a little bit of steam for some entertainment And if you guys are not familiar with Patricia Cornwell, she's a fairly prolific, very famous, successful true crime writer. You have to take what she says for a grain of salt, as we're doing with Portrait of a Killer. Basically, her thesis in this book, retrospective, is that Jack the Ripper is in fact the famous artist Walter Sickert himself. Is it true? Is it not true? Is it possible? It's obviously feasible and potentially plausible the way that Cornwell is presenting this information. A lot of people have sort of criticized her research methods and sort of her overly feminist, political driven worldview. Perhaps we can see that. I think Patricia Cornwell comes from a particular, socio-political standpoint, which I think does influence her worldview in terms of true crime. But it is nonetheless interesting, and I would say I'm somewhat of a fan of Walter Sickert's art, even though I agree with Patricia Cornwell that it is kind of ugly. It is a little bit suspicious. The fact that Walter Sickert was so desperately obsessed with Jack the Ripper case is also puzzling, and he allegedly lived in one of the former apartments of Jack the Ripper himself. But just a wonderful, engagingly fascinating retrospective of Jack the Ripper and true crime. We get these wonderful sort of explanations of the socio-political and economic society of Whitechapel and East End London of the late 1800s, obviously during the time of Jack the Ripper. And we get these just these wonderful monologues that Patricia Cornwell goes on for us about the cultural complexities of, post-industrial revolution England and in Europe, and that tense society between upper and lower class, and the fact that so many of these individuals and these characters are living in complete squalor, and they're completely destitute, and no wonder they had so many horrific crimes back then. And obviously we still see that problem today, but like I said, whether or not her thesis is true, whether or not it's valid, it does have some great illustrations and photographs in here. She does a good job of sort of portraying Walter Sickert as this deranged sicko, but is it fair? Is it accurate? Is her research, has it been peer reviewed by the experts? I'm not sure, but I think authors should be free to sort of come up with new ideas and just kind of riff on hunches even, that's how we solve crimes, and that's how people continue to speculate and sort of analyze history as a whole, is by sometimes coming up with controversial theses and controversial ideas. So that is Patricia Cornwell's Portrait of a Killer. We'll probably do a full in-depth true crime edition of that once we finish it. And lastly but not leastly, coming in at number, I think this is the 5th book, is Liz Phair's Horror Stories Memoir. And unfortunately, probably one of the most underwhelming memoirs by a famous person that I've ever read. And I don't mean to say that it's good or it's not well written, because it is engaging. It does have some interesting anecdotes, but it's fairly self-indulgent as far as, and I guess maybe we could expect that from Liz Phair, but I guess I was expecting the joy and the complexity and the beauty of Liz Phair's music and the profundity of it to sort of transfer over to her memoir. But I guess I was, overreaching there a little bit, because it is a little bit underwhelming. It comes across as a little bit, I'm not trying to sound super political here, but it does come across as a little bit conceited and even classist, and even just sort of snarky and kind of stuck up. And then obviously Liz Phair's lyrics and her music can often come across like that, but it was kind of in a good way musically that hasn't, to me at least, translated as well with her writing. I'm assuming she wrote a lot of this. Maybe she had a ghostwriter. You never know with famous people's memoirs. Does anybody write their own memoirs? I highly doubt that Slash, wrote his own memoir, or Nikki Sixx definitely, I highly doubt, was keeping a diary every day while he was, addicted to heroin back in the 80s, but who knows? So it's a controversial memoir, but it's an interesting memoir. And I think what stands out about Liz Phair's Horror Stories memoir is that she took a different approach, and she's sort of taking the spotlight off of the super traumatic or things that most people would talk about in a rock or music memoir, and she's focusing on the little things that sort of build up and become sort of these horror stories throughout our lives. And I think that is kind of what makes Liz Phair's horror stories a little more interesting, and maybe we'll do a rereading of it at some point. We're almost towards the tail end of it, but I just feel like I was always left wanting more with each chapter, and I never really quite got to maybe the root or the cause of what makes Liz Phair tick. I think maybe she was holding back a little bit, but maybe she took this approach in order to sort of explore more easily or more profoundly those complex issues of life and the music business that would be harder to do if she was just talking about drug addiction or constantly talking about sex or violence or something like we would see in other famous memoirs. But just a little bit underwhelming and a little bit snarky and a little bit I wasn't really left really liking Liz Phair, I would say, as a person as much as I was really hoping to. But maybe that's kind of the point, is that she's knocking herself off of whatever pedestal the public or her fan base has sort of put her on, and she talks about a lot of the struggles, the psychosexual struggles of men and women, and the struggles that she's had with fame and with fortune and all of that, interesting stuff, profound stuff that comes up in Rock and Roll Memoirs. We are almost at 30 minutes. I think we're going to end this video. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I'm really glad to be uploading again. Make sure you guys comment down which book is your favorite down below. Which books have you read? What books out of the list, my reading list, do you want to read for yourself? And we will see you all in the next video. Make sure you guys hit me up on social media, and happy reading.